Hi folks, Andy the Taxman here. Before we get into today's program, please take a minute to rate, review, and subscribe to Grappling with Canada on any podcasting platform of your choice.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Canadian Big Time Wrestling featuring the world's greatest wrestlers. The contestants for these bouts have already been instructed by the referee, and this is bout number one. One fall with a 30-minute time limit. And introducing first, ladies and gentlemen, from North Bay, weighing 235 pounds, Gene Dubois. His opponent tonight from Stuttgart, Germany.
I'm your host, Andy the Taxman. This is Grappling with Canada. Hello listeners, and welcome back to Grappling with Canada. Today is going to be an interesting episode. Normally, as you know, these episodes are massive deep dives into the life, career, and trajectory of certain individuals from Canadian professional wrestling history. In the back catalog, you would naturally see such characters as Rowdy Roddy Piper, George Gordienko, Billy Two Rivers, Stu Hart, Rhonda Singh, among many, many others who we have profiled in excess on the program Grappling with Canada. Today is a little bit different because this episode, quite honestly, is almost a lead-in into our July episode, which is why in your podcast feed you will see that this episode has not come out on June 1st, it comes out on June 30th. There will be an episode on July 1st. Both of these episodes are intertwined with each other. I think you'll understand why as we progress in today's episode. Now, as I said, normally these episodes are a deep dive look. We go, well into the career of the individual. We look at match histories, match statistics. We look at where they came from, what they did, who they were. All of that we will get into in some form or fashion in today's episode, but it's going to be much more free-flowing than most of the episodes that I've done on Grappling with Canada. Also, we will only have one guest on today's episode, and that is a big fan, first off, but more than that, a curator of history of our subject matter today, Dave McKigney. Now, later on in the episode, you're going to hear a lot from good friend of the show, Wes Maymont, who runs a tremendous amount of Facebook groups dedicated to the preservation of professional wrestling history, but specifically, and the one that we're going to be more focused on today, the history of the Bearman, Dave McKigney. You're going to hear from Wes later on in the episode about all things Dave McKigney from not just the fan perspective, but also somebody who's spent a good majority of his adult life looking into, researching, cataloging, and saving, most importantly, the history of the promoter, of the wrestler, of the man, Dave McKigney. And I'm really looking forward to presenting that interview, that conversation to everybody, because Dave McKigney is one of these polarizing individuals in Canadian professional wrestling history. A couple of reasons for this exist. One is, and this is my personal opinion on it, there's a lot of information out there that paints Dave McKigney as, just a quote-unquote outlaw promoter. That would be somebody who's not affiliated with any of the major promotions. That would be back in the day, promotions such as the WWF, the AWA, the NWA, even, you go into Mid-South, you can go to Portland. he was not affiliated with any of these. He ran his own promotion. So we automatically get a strike against him from wrestling individuals who cover the sport, but really only cover what happened with the big ones, the NWA, the AWA, the WWF. So he doesn't get his due there. What happens then, obviously, as we all know in professional wrestling, things are misconstrued. And then they are retroactively reported on after being misconstrued, if you will. And it furthers the misconception of just how important an individual was. We've seen this in countless times, and many times on this program. You will look at Rhonda Singh, for example, as a prime example of this. Many people will look at her WWF run, which was abhorrent. Let's be honest about it. But many people have not gone back to discover her WWA run, her run in AJW, for example, and just what an impact she had on the sport in itself and what her presentation meant for many people coming up, many women coming up in the professional wrestling world at that time. Like I said, today is going to be a much more free-flowing episode. Footloose and fancy-free, if you will. Because the July episode is going to be very, very heavy subject matter. But it also ties into directly the individual that we're going to be talking about today, Dave McKigney. So, like I said, Wes Mayment is going to be joining me on the program. You can look in the show notes of today's episode. You will see listed the Facebook groups that Wes runs. You will also see a link to his podcast, the NWCA podcast, with his co-host, Jesse, who was also a previous guest on Grappling with Canada. That would have been the Whipper Billy Watson episode in Season 2, which you can find in your back catalog of Grappling with Canada on whatever podcasting platform that you are currently listening to this show on. Now, who was Dave McKigney? This is an interesting question, so perhaps we should start there, and then we're going to jump right into a fun conversation. So, for those who are unaware, Dave McKigney was born June 9th, 1932 in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. His start in professional wrestling is interesting. In around 1949, the future wild man, Dave McKigney, was a 17-year-old and was competing in amateur wrestling in the Toronto area. He was really a rough and tumble character in real life and in the ring, when he ended up meeting up with Tom Rusk, who wrestled as Red Hawk in the territory. Red Hawk would go on to train McKigney a little bit, but more importantly allowed McKigney to be in the safe comfort of a wrestling ring. And I legitimately mean that. McKigney actually slept in the middle of the ring when he was training with just a pillow and a cover. Wrestlers would come and bring him food, and they would train him, and this would go on for weeks and weeks. Now, through Rusk, McKigney would meet other wrestlers, including Red Gardner, who you're going to hear about later on in the episode, and specifically with my discussion with Wes Mayment. He would also start appearing around shows in Toronto, billed as the Flying Frenchman Jacques Dubois, or sometimes Frenchy Dubois. Now, these names might get confusing, but a lot of this will be a lot more clear in my conversation with Wes Mayment. McKigney would also go on to appear in both Eastern and Western Canada, using different names such as Jean Dubois. He would also be billed as Pierre Dubois, Dave Dubois, or Mike Dubois. Again, these are aspects that will be covered in my conversation upcoming with Wes Mayment. So that kind of sets the stage for the early life of the Bearman. From there, you're going to hear my conversation with Wes Mayment. But before that, I want to play some classic audio. Now, unfortunately, there is not a lot of video evidence of the Bearman or of his matches, his presentation, his promotional skills, promos. Much of that is lost to time. But there is a couple of important things that he brought to the table, one of which is the Wrestling Bear. So what I'm going to play for you is actually a conversation between wrestling historians Jim Cornette and Dave Meltzer. Now, this is from roughly 10 years ago. They were actually watching and critiquing a match between Dave McKigney, the Wild Man, and Terrible Ted, the Wrestling Bear, which you're going to hear a lot more about in my discussion with Wes Maidment. So in this discussion, not only are you going to hear their interpretation of the match that they're watching at the time, but you're also going to get a brief history of the Wrestling Bear aspect in professional wrestling, because that's going to come up in my conversation with Wes Maidment. And you're also going to hear a little bit more nuance about Dave McKigney. So I'm going to play some classic audio. This is about a 7-minute clip. And then on the other side, we're going to get right down to business. My tremendous conversation with Wes Maidment. Please enjoy.
This is an attraction that hasn't been around for probably a good 25 years. This is the Wrestling Bear, Terrible Ted, and this looks like it's Buffalo, New York. That's his trainer, Gene Dubois. And he's actually going to wrestle his trainer. Wrestling Bears were they were a real big attraction, I guess, in the 60s and probably the early 70s, and then
late 70s, as a matter of fact, as late as the late 70s, early 80s in Tennessee. Nick Goulas in Tennessee used to love to use Wrestling Bears, but in this case, Gene Dubois, the Bears trainer, is going to wrestle the Bear, whereas in a lot of the southern circuits, the Bear was always used to wrestle either maybe the most hated wrestling manager or one of the top heels.
Right, a lot of times the manager. There's a problem, of course, with wrestling the bear. If you think about, sports entertainment and what wrestling is, and it's really hard to teach a bear to, do a spectacular ring entrance, do good high spots, and I mean, so, this is a different form of a match than you're normally used to.
Well, you'll notice also the bear has a muzzle. There's obviously a really good reason for that because...
guys are scared to wrestle bears for,
Oh, well, even if you train a bear and even if you teach a bear to wrestle and even if a bear is tamed and domesticated, it still has its cranky points, especially if it's a female bear during certain times of the month or if it's supposed to be hibernating during certain times of the year. But these bears are so strong... If he wanted to, he could take that muzzle and hit you one time in the stomach or in the chest with that big nose and break every rib in your body. So these bears are dangerous.
They're very dangerous, and one of the reasons why they don't have it is because many of the bear trainers, the bears have hurt people. I mean, David McKigney's wife was killed.
Yeah, the Canadian wild man who trained bears for a long time in Canada. His wife was killed by the bear, and as well, there's been instances where the bears would get aggravated by flashes of cameras or something that would happen. It would come over the top rope and go out into the crowd, which generally caused the consternation you would imagine when a 600 or 800 pound bear goes flying through ringside wrestling seats. People generally scurry.
Luckily, this bear was trained in amateur wrestling and not professional wrestling, so he's knowing not to break too many rules or get too vicious. He knows his limitations. But some of those bears, when they're if you by accident got them riled up, it could be a really scary situation. I once saw a match in this was not a match. What am I saying? This was an incident in Canada where they brought Yoshiaki Fujiwara, from Japan, since he was like this great shooter, and they had a real wild bear. They had a bear that was not trained to wrestle, and he jumped in this pen that this very nasty bear was in, and I mean the bear would just growl at him and things like that. And it's like, I mean, he is the bravest man that I've ever seen just to go in the pen, and then the bear would look at him and just see him as like this competing animal and just charge at him. And I mean, knocked him silly. Oh my God, the bear didn't realize that his opponent, the referee, was not his opponent. I think.
Well, then you've also got to realize, the bear has no shoulders, so how are you going to pin the bear? That's another problem. Bobby Eaton wrestled a bear one time in his life. Bobby Eaton is scared to death of big dogs, but he had to wrestle a bear, and the bear was being really stiff with him.
Oh, no, that's it. He's trying to get the referee to wrestle a bear, which is probably pretty smart.
And the referee's smart enough not to. And you know how big Bobby Eaton's fists are. He drew back and just drilled the bear in between the eyes with a right hand as hard as he could.
Oh, I think that would be a dumb idea.
The bear lightened up. The bear lightened up after that. He started working with him. But that's a true story. And Jerry Lawler wrestled a bear one time, and it was the only time that I can remember. He's going to try to pin him, but wait a minute.
Oh,
the only time I can remember the bear won a match by disqualification, Lawler pulled out a chain and hit the bear with a chain and was disqualified.
Oh my God. Well, I have seen matches where the bear has won by countout when the guy just goes, okay, you're just not paying me enough, and I'm leaving. In fact, I saw Superstar Billy Graham did that once. I think it was in one of the cities in the Bay Area. I don't think it was San Francisco. And it was just he was attempting to have a match with the bear, and it was just sort of like, I think the bear's muzzle actually got off, and it was like, okay, I'm losing this match by countout.
The referee was out of the ring there, which I think is the best place for the referee to be in a match like this. I remember Nick Adams, who used to train a bear named Gentleman Ben,
and also Terrible Ted,
Terrible Ted would often give the bear a Coke that he would sit up and he would drink out of a bottle after the match.
That's right. I remember that. I remember that thing with the bear sitting there in the ring, and it was.
One time he wouldn't leave the ring because he wanted more Cokes. They didn't have any more Cokes in bottles. He didn't know how to drink out of a cup, and it was a slightly nasty scene because the bear wouldn't leave and they couldn't make him.
Oh. Probably held up the show.
Oh, wait a minute. I think that's...
He hit the referee.
That would appear to be the end of the match because bears don't know the rules very well. But unfortunately...
This one did, though.
This one was a good flying a good flying mare artist.
Yeah.
But whether you beat the opponent or you beat the referee, the point is it was a great attraction in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s
He's still wrestling Gene Dubois.
To see the wrestling bear.
It was a good attraction, though. I remember, the crowds were up when the bear would come. Roy Shires used to bring the bear into San Francisco, and that bear knows to lay down a little bit. Now, with Fujiwara, of course, he was a master of submissions, and somehow or other, the bear was very good at defending submissions, so Fujiwara did not get a chance to utilize any of those holds he knows.
How would the bear tap, I wonder?
I think he would just...
With his forelegs or his back legs?
I think that if you got a submission on him, I think he would, bite your arm off, so... maybe he wouldn't tap.
Then there's a problem also
there's a single leg. That poor referee doesn't know what's going on.
There was a female wrestling bear that used to compete, and I'm trying to remember, even though it was given a male name, it was a female bear. And the female bear would sometimes take an amorous liking to some of its opponents and roll its opponents up underneath it and begin frantic motions, which the opponents would not appreciate very much.
Yeah. Now, see, that bear did a pretty good spot. That's actually a better wrestler than Hulk Hogan, though.
Well, the bear has exhibited more moves in this match so far than Hulk Hogan and Kevin Nash put together. And actually, the bear...
Not only that, the bear sells better.
Yes, and is willing to go down, and the bear has more hair than Hogan, and it's not as gray as Nash.
I think he's got him pinned now, though. The referee just doesn't want to count. The referee's got the chain. The referee's going to pull the bear off. Now
wait a minute.
I don't know about that one. I don't know if I would do... Oh! Bear took down the referee again.
The bear seems to be an unstoppable force.
Yeah.
And I'm surprised that, if Jim Hurd had been around in the 50s, he would have thought of this instead of the hunchbacks and the ding-dongs.
Right. Well, actually, he did. But he used them in ring entrances. He just didn't have them wrestle with Matt Bourne. Remember when Matt Bourne, it was Big Josh?
That's
and
true.
He came out with the two dancing bears, which, by the way, was the same night that Kevin Nash debuted as Oz.
So they could have saved some money. They could have had Kevin Nash impersonate one of the bears. But he can't dance as well as wrestle.
But I'm sure he can drink Coke, though.
I'm sure he can do a lot of things with Coke. You could drink it. You could pour it over your head. You could do all sorts of things.
I have friends that I've met that traveled on his shows, and they got to know him. They got to meet him. They got to know the wrestlers. They got let in, so to speak. And they say nothing except what a great guy he was. He always paid what he promised. He would lose out of his own pocket to pay his guys, and that stands a lot to testament. Considering, yes, some towns you're going to only draw 200 because the weather's too nice or it's too cold or it's too wet or whatever. The aspect of him being an Ontario or Canadian wrestling icon is completely overlooked. And I think that more people should take the consideration, of thinking about how it worked back in the 70s. This is not the 90s. This is not the 2000s. This is the late 60s and the 70s. And yeah, the guys drove 1 billion miles in Ontario. Hi, I'm Wes Maidment, and I'm here with Andy tonight talking about one of my favorite things, Dave McKigney. You can find us on the Facebook with our 5 Facebook wrestling history pages, the Ontario Wrestling Clippings of the Past, the Wildman page, the BC Tribute page, the Ric Flair Tribute page, and the National Wrestling Clippings Alliance main page. Also, we have the NWCA podcast on our YouTube channel. You can check that out at NWCA Podcast on YouTube.
Do you know what year specifically he started training?
It's not specific. I don't have an exact date, but I do know he debuted, I'm pretty sure, in 1953.
Yes, because he was training with Red Gardner, correct?
Correct.
Yes. Okay. So maybe we'll start with that. So he starts training in early 50s. He's training with Red Gardner. Maybe give a little bit of background on Red Gardner, whatever you have from your internal data banks, if you will.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So Dave McKigney started out as a really skinny, small kid, starting out training with Red Gardner. Red Gardner had a small promotion north of Toronto called the CCWA, Central Canadian Wrestling Association, featured mostly lightweight guys, light heavyweight guys. But the main thing that came from Red Gardner, obviously, was Dave McKigney, the Wild Man, who, was an icon in Ontario for decades. But we also had Bull Johnson, who helped train out of there, also out of Hamilton. And, of course, Waldo Von Erich and Baron Cicluna and Gito Mongol all spent some time with Red Gardner learning the trade and applying in small little, really small halls around Ontario and around the Toronto. They never ventured that much into Toronto because obviously Frank Tunney owned and ruled everything, but they did venture into very small halls, and they're no competition whatsoever, but they still pack fans in every week in some of their local establishments.
Okay, so that kind of leads us to his start with Maple Leaf Wrestling, because obviously, like you said, the Tunneys ruled the roost, as you will, in Maple Leaf Wrestling. So how did he get his start getting into Maple Leaf Wrestling? And then maybe let's get into the Flying Frenchman name that he had before he started the other names.
So we know that he became famous because of his bear, Terrible Ted, and that's where he got in the start in the early 60s. Well, I should say that in the late 50s. He got the bear in approximately 1958, and that changed the whole outlook on things for all the promoters in the local area, because they could bring Dave and his bear in as an added attraction. Frank wasn't stupid. Frank booked him quite a bit in different halls. He was going under the name of Jean Dubois, the Flying Frenchman at the time, he also had Dave Dubois and Jean Dubois, as in the French spelling of John. He took the bear and him all over Ontario, and they would headline actually in some of Chinese cities like Hamilton, St. Catharines, Niagara Falls, and then generally around the Toronto general market area, but never headlining in Maple Leaf Gardens, of course. Dave was small. Dave was a short guy. He was like maybe 5'10". At that time, he was not even probably 200 pounds. So he just couldn't stand with the big boys, like with Kinniski and Kowalski and some of the guys they had in Toronto at the time. Flying Frenchman, I don't really know where it came from, other than it was a gimmick name that would have probably given him some allure for, I don't even know if he could speak French. The guy, he was part Scottish, so I mean, he probably didn't even speak French. But yeah, he was built from Sudbury and North Bay and different, quote, French-speaking places.
Now, I think Terrible Ted is something that we need to dive into a little bit here, because I don't know when else on the podcast we'll be able to talk about a live wrestling bear. So for individuals who are not familiar, Terrible Ted was the one of the draws, if you will, of that time. And correct me if I'm wrong, but Terrible Ted was bought from a circus that was going out of or going out of business, I guess is the proper way to put it. But not only that, the bear was de-toothed and declawed, which is an interesting. I mean, nowadays that would be very, very much frowned upon, but back in the day, that was kind of the sideshow attraction appeal, having 7 foot, 600-pound bear on your tour as a traveling circus aspect.
Andy, believe me, I'm not that enamored with the bear. A lot of people are. My podcast partner Jesse is just enamored with the bear wrestling. I would never have gotten in the ring ever. I know people who have personally. People who've gotten in the ring with the bear. I would never do that. I never would want to even step in the ring. But I don't understand the lure of it. It just doesn't do anything for me at all. Like some people don't like the lady wrestlers. Some people don't like the midget wrestlers or what have you. But it just doesn't interest me whatsoever. But Dave and Ted had a relationship, and that's right from everybody I talked to that knew both of them. How are you going to know a bear? But if you stayed with Dave at any point in time, which some of the people I've talked to have, they said that the bear was awesome. He was trained. He was like a big dog, and Dave toured constantly with Terrible Ted, probably crossing the states at least 5 times. California, Nevada, Arizona, right down the West Coast, and then through Texas, over to Florida, and then back up the East Coast. And he usually made it back up to Canada just in time for the summer season.
See, it's interesting you bring up the part about, Ted and Dave having quite the relationship, but the fans had quite the relationship with the matches between Ted and Dave. And we're not talking about fans, in the 200, 300, 400 fan range. We're talking about crowds of 8,000 plus, including Boxing Day in 1958. There was 8,250 fans who went to Maple Leaf Gardens to see Terrible Ted and Dave McKigney have their match. And Terrible Ted with the big victory in that one, I think, sent a lot of the fans home happy. But I'm with you. The thought of jumping in the ring against a bear, whether or not he has his fangs, if you will, is quite the daunting task to hop into a ring in regards to.
My good friend Terry Dart, the late Terry Dart, he actually got in the ring more than once with Ted. And Ted slipped and fell on Terry's ankle, broke his ankle, and they, if you want to call it, they finished the match. Terry hobbled out of the ring, stayed for the rest of the show, and then drove himself to the hospital to get his ankle put on in a cast. And that scares the living bejesus out of me, thinking like. Put yourself in Andy. Oh, Andy, come on up into the ring here. We're just going to throw you off the ropes a couple times, but I can't do it. No, it's okay. They drag you in. They throw you off the ropes. The next thing you know, someone's giving you, even if it was a soft clothesline, right? The bear falling on you. My God, they're probably not 700 pounds, but they're at least 400 pounds, anyways. I don't get it.
Yeah, it's not one of my most planned things to do in the ring, certainly speaking. But it is interesting that so he has Terrible Ted, he's making a name for himself, and that's kind of when he starts to make the transition into the Dave McKigney that we would know later in life as the Wild Man. What do you know about his transformation and how he started to, he grew out the beard, he grew out the hair, he started to adopt this a different personality? Was that specifically because of the matches with Ted, or is this something that he kind of picked up on and planned on doing throughout his early stages of his career?
I don't know 100%, but I'm quite sure that it was a look that would coincide with the bear. The big hairy bear, obviously big hairy Dave, because he was a bushy man. That wild man gimmick, which so many people have used, like Furpo, and I'm trying to think of guys that had long straggly hair and covered themselves up with the hair and big beards and stuff. It was just a gimmick. It was just a thing. I think he started not shaving in approximately 71, 72. I think he was still clean shaven. And he also, one of the other guys who came out of, not necessarily out of the camp with him, but basically grew up with him in that 60s time frame was Willie the Wolfman. And there was another hairy, long-haired, bearded guy who they complemented each other really, really well. And they were a great traveling tag team also for I don't know, close to 20 years.
See, it's interesting too because a lot of fans will obviously know Dave McKigney in his Toronto aspect, but he went to Stampede and had quite the run there as well, and he was using his plethora of names there as well. It's interesting, when we go through the timeline of Canadian professional wrestlers, normally they'll start with the name, maybe they'll morph to another one, and then they'll kind of settle on their main name, and that's kind of the one that you see them traveling around Canada with. But McKigney is kind of a weird one because, like you said earlier, right? He's Gene Dubois, then he's Pierre Dubois, then he's Dave Dubois, then he's the Wild Man, then he's the Canadian Wild Man. When did he start to settle on the Wild Man as his traveling gimmick full time rather than moving territory to territory with these rotating plethora of names?
Okay, and he had a rotating plethora. I do have a list of some of his names. He used Mike Dubois, which was funny because that was like Cecil Dubois' real name, I think, the chap from Montreal, and his. I think in 1972, Dave started working with the WWA out of Indianapolis with Snyder and the Bruiser, and he was billed as the Beast in the WWA when they were taking some of the guys and the Bear and his stepdaughter Rachel down to Indianapolis and Chicago and Detroit to wrestle for the WWA. Late 73, basically no more Gene Dubois. It was pretty much always the Wild Man. But it's funny, Andy, the guys I talked to that worked with him and were back in that day in the 70s, they all called him the Bearman, which is another name, but it was more like the guys in the dressing room would call him the Bearman as opposed to the fans knowing him as the Bearman. And I've always known him as the Wild Man. And all my research, everything I usually write about him is basically either Dave or the Wild Man.
See, the Bearman part is interesting too because obviously he was traveling with Terrible Ted and he was kind of known as almost the Bear Whisperer, and we'll get into that a little bit later in the episode as well. But the Wild Man is the one that seems to stick in the majority of wrestling fans' minds today, right? And you can see it. We see the post on, the Pro Wrestling History Facebook page or any of your national clipping pages. It's almost always now the Wild Man. But it is interesting that there were so many of these different names throughout all these different territories, like you said. He's in Tri-States. He's in Stampede. He's out further east. He's down very into the deep south, and all these names, but it's the same person.
Yeah.
And he plays off this character, like you said, that is not a character specific to him because there were other ones like Pampero Firpo, who's a tremendous Wild Man. There are several others that come to mind quickly, but he kind of stands out as this Canadian style of these international wild men, if you will, who are running wild between, the 50s, 60s, and 70s throughout North America.
It's funny because when you try to research things on the internet, and I was thinking about it today, Andy. I've probably researched on the internet him for, I think I counted up 19 years now that I've been doing research on him on the internet, and I believe me, I've fallen down the rabbit hole a million times. So it's so strange to be looking for different names and you have no idea sometimes. Like when you look for Gene Kiniski, you might see Gene misspelled, might. And sometimes, yes, this Kiniski is misspelled by accident in the ad. But Gene Kiniski is Gene Kiniski. He was at the start, he was Gene Kiniski. At the end, he was Gene Kiniski. There's no hardly ever any deviation whatsoever. And Dave was in the ads in the late 80s, he was billed as the Canadian Wild Man, which, okay, another one, right? He just really had that. I don't know what it was, maybe different areas he wanted to be billed differently or something. But yeah, as we grew more into the 80s and he was more of a stay-at-home guy in Ontario, he was just the Wild Man. Everyone knew just the Wild Man. Oh, the Wild Man shows are coming to town or whatever, right?
So I think that's an interesting aspect to think about, and I want to get back to that in a second. But what I want to kind of circle back to is the perception of the Wild Man, because like you said, from your research, right, finding out information, if it's misspelled, if it's mislabeled, whatever, you're going through research and you're trying to find, Dave, is it actually him? Was he actually there? But a lot of that is because he was in so many different places, right? And you look at all the different territories that he was wrestling in. Obviously, we have the Canadian ones we just listed, but he was wrestling in Georgia Championship Wrestling. He was with the WWA, like you said earlier. He was also in the AWA for quite a while. That's one of the common misconceptions that I seem to find when I'm going through, whether it's Facebook groups or you see it on Twitter, or you'll see, short video clips on, Daily Motion or whatever. And it's often framed that Dave McKigney was just the local Canadian guy. But that's not necessarily the case when you start to dig into his worldly travels, if you will. And I'm not talking about just North America. Like he had some shots in Japan as well. But these aren't shots just against, enhancement talents, and he's not just a spot in a card. He's wrestling some big name talent. Maybe can you just for a second elaborate a little bit more on some of the bigger name talent that he ended up facing both in North America and then in overseas?
Sure. When I stumbled upon his Japanese results, I was shocked. I mean, he has a DQ win over Inoki. And he's got some really big wins against lesser guys who were coming up still in Japan. And that's pretty amazing considering he would have been in the mid 70s. He would have been 35, 40, great shape for the guy, but still not a famous worldwide name, although he did tour Germany and England. I have found some results from England with him, and he was billed as a Dubois there, Scotland and Wales and England. So, I mean, 50, 55 and part of 1956, he was in England and Europe for close to a year. And a lot of people just, it's just the Wild Man, just that guy that promotes small little shitty little towns in Ontario. And, he's got all these old guys. But the guy had a massive career. If he hadn't have died, he probably would have been wrestling for at least, I would say, 2 more or 3 more years. And we can talk about what may have happened after the accident later if you wish.
Yes, and I would like to get to that. But I want to stay on something you just said there is, the perception that, he was, quote, just that Ontario guy wrestling just these small territories. Because you look at the list of opponents that he had over the years, you talked about Inoki, who we went into depth last episode on my episode talking about the Great Antonio and what happened with the Great Antonio versus Antonio Inoki.
Yeah.
But, to get even a DQ win over Inoki in Japan was a big deal. And we're talking about 75. That's when Inoki was a god.
Yep, for sure.
Like the way that wrestling fans in North America would view Hulk Hogan in the late 80s, that was Inoki in, you could realistically say from 71 to like 79. And here's McKigney over there in 75 getting a win over him. But you look at some of the big names that he wrestled, even just domestically, right? He had big matches against another Canadian WWF champion at the time, Ivan Koloff, for example. He defeated Lou Albano at the time, was a huge deal with the WWF, right? Like he's also wrestling a young Roddy Piper at one point I believe that was in the AWA. So you look at his match listing, his match trajectory. It's not like he was some enhancement talent schlub like we're talking about, right? I know that's kind of the way that misinformed, possibly, modern style fans would look at him now. When you just look at him as, oh, he was that Ontario promoter guy, they don't take the time to go back into his match history and understand, how he rose through the ranks in North America. Maybe that is because of the name issue that we've, talked about at some length so far, because it's hard to, it's real easy to go through the internet and find Roddy Piper, and you get, 50 match results, and you can see all the big stars. It's a lot harder for somebody like McKigney, who had different ring names in different promotions, wrestling at different times. So it is difficult to get an actual chronological match listing unless you're willing to put in the time and effort like you have done.
It's strange, like we talk about, and he's considered, I don't consider him, but he's considered basically in nowadays as a nobody. People only know him in modern day standards, like you said, because of his posters. And that's it. It's not, there's hardly anything, no one cares. And I don't really think, Andy, I really don't think for some reason that Dave didn't care either. He knew he was always coming home. I think he always knew he was coming home. He was on a tour, he had his book dates. Maybe if he was gone for, say, 3 months or 4 months and with the Bear, or even when he didn't have the Bear. And yeah, him and Willie the Wolfman, they would tour the outside, basically, of New York City, WWF in the early 70s. As you mentioned, he was one of the first people to face Ivan Koloff before Ivan lost the belt to Pedro Morales. And he wrestled everybody in the WWF in the early 70s. Cicluna, who was one of his training partners, he wrestled Morales, he wrestled Strongbow tons of times. And I think also traveling all through North America and Canada, he would be a guy that would say, hey, look, eventually I'm going to get my own promotion. Maybe we'll exchange numbers, and maybe you can come up and work for me. And I think that was one of the reasons how he was able to get so many great names over his promoting career. And Andy, I've looked at his promoting career, and I have approximately 1,200 matches as the Wild Man or the Canadian Wild Man or Gene Dubois through his promoting career from about 1966 right to his death in 1988.
Okay, that's something that we're going to circle back to in just a minute as well, because as prolific as his wrestling career was, I think his promoting career is one again that's really overlooked. And again, you can look on message boards and what have you. Like you said, a lot of fans will gravitate to the posters because they were and still are like one of those things that kind of catches your eye throughout all the kind of wrestling noise, if you will, out there. There's this odd misconception that, he would, quote, just book the old guys or just have the old timers in there. And that's not necessarily the case. And we'll dig into that in just a second. But I want to stay on this thought of him as a wrestler and what he brought to the table in all these different markets, because again, here's somebody who he's not your standard mechanic, right? He's not coming in to shine up the local baby face. He's not coming in as the monster heel or anything like that, but he's one of these guys who comes in and just makes connections. And it almost seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but he seems to make connections in every promotion, then use those connections to get himself further along in each successive promotion, while at the same time planting the seeds for having these individuals that he's making these connections with to come into his promotion when he's ready to make that step later in life.
What I've read when researching his travels through the States was that he was well liked. And you got to figure if we were touring as a tag team, say, and you were a great star, and I was just tagging along with you like a lot of the tag teams of the older days where there was a young guy and an older veteran kind of guy. I think a lot of times if Dave wasn't a wrestler, he wouldn't have got on the card because he just would have been the Bear, and the Bear would have been going up against the number one heel at the time or the whatever, right? So Dave wrestled on every single card practically. He didn't wrestle the Bear. He wrestled on the undercard on just about every card he ever wrestled. So a lot of times he was working two times a night. And everything I've read has been that the guy was a hand. He could do it. I mean, he could go full on baby face or full on heel. No ifs, ands, or buts based on who he was going to wrestle and where and when he was in whatever promotion he was in. He used to go through the Mid-Atlantic states and wrestle just about every night for 2 or 3 weeks straight, just do the circle. And it would be probably one night with him wrestling someone, and the Bear would come in as some sort of a DQ finish or something like that. And then the next week or the next 2 weeks, when the next show would be there, they would have him at the Bear. And he had the talent. And I think he liked traveling, but I think he was a homebody, and I think he liked coming home.
The homebody thing is not something that's specific to him either, because there's a lot of wrestlers, and we've seen it throughout the years, who like to stay in their general territory, right? I'm thinking about somebody like a Stu Hart, for example.
We could pick Mad Dog Frenchie Pelican out of Manitoba.
Yeah.
Some of the other guys who were big here, they lasted a long time, but they just didn't want to travel. They had a half decent job that they wanted to hang on to, or they just didn't want to travel and be away from home.
So it's interesting that here's somebody who wants to be close to home, but then moves into the promotion side of things. So maybe that's a good segue to move into that portion of his career. So from all your research, when was the seed started to be planted for him to move into the promotion range, and what really was the genesis for him to start promoting shows himself?
I think that Red Garner probably taught all the guys really, really well. Von Erich, Cicluna, Jito Mongol. I think he taught them all really well. I think he probably taught them all aspects of the business so that they could carry on if they so desired. Dave was promoting by himself in the late 50s, 58, 59, and they were doing some very, very short, small tours with Waldo and Cicluna and Jito Mongol. So, they were booking the very small halls, so the very small arenas in the summertime in Ontario, and they were doing the rounds and being rather successful. Dave got the Bear. He realized the Bear was money, and they started getting booked while doing the Bear routine. And like I said, he did 4 or 5 tours of North America. So coming back home, working Terrible Ted in Quebec, working with Terrible Ted in Ontario through the summertime, Dave started promoting. My research says 1965, and that was late summer '65. That was in conjunction with Whipper Watson, who I think had sort of broken away from Tunney at the time and maybe wanted a little piece of his own action, especially for his son Phil, who was coming up. Well, actually for his son John. Whipper Watson had two sons. His older son John, who was the first Whipper Watson Jr., got hurt and he quit the business, and then Philip, who was the more famous Whipper Watson Jr., came along, and he was a very, very frequent partner with Dave in the early days, promoting and working on his cards. So yeah, I'd say 65, 66 for sure. I do have articles that say Whipper Watson stating that Dave McKigney is his promoter, and they're working in conjunction during the summer circuit in Ontario, the cottage circuit or summer circuit, whatever you want to call it.
Now, Whipper Watson is an interesting name that would be advertised as or that he would advertise as McKigney as his promoter, because obviously we know Whipper Watson and his connection with the Toronto office and the Tunneys. Maybe can you go into detail a little bit about the friction between the Wild Man and the Toronto office?
The great battles going on there. There's such a love-hate relationship. Frank and Dave worked together, then they didn't work together. Then they worked together, and they didn't work together. Frank rented Dave's ring. The ring wouldn't show up. Then Frank was pissed, and it was on and on and on and off. I should say on and off, on and off, on and off. There's been reports of Dave McKigney speaking to the newspaper saying, "I wouldn't work for Tunney. I wouldn't work for Crockett. I wouldn't work for those crooks. They're blah 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 blah." And it's like the wrestling business, Andy. 2 weeks later, oh, we need a ring and bring your bear. And and the money's right. The price is, oh, we're friends now. So yeah, it's they promoted against each other a few times. Dave lost the big ones, but he won all the little ones. And it's funny because Dave promoted in Varsity Arena in Toronto, 1971 September, with a really big card. He had Blackjack Mulligan, who came from Montreal. He had the Hollywood Blondes, who came from Montreal. He had some guys from Pittsburgh come up for the show, and it would have been a great show. But he picked a Sunday night to go up against Frank Tunney and his show, probably all 5 miles away at Maple Leaf Gardens. Dave lost his shirt massively. Frank just jam-packed his show with people, and it was a loss, a complete loss. But he didn't stop, because he knew that, I guess he just felt that he was going to be the promoter in the area that wasn't Frank. And in London, Ontario, Frank had started dwindling down his cards in about 72, 73. They were weekly cards in London, Ontario during the school season, so September to June. And then they were once every 2 weeks. Then it was once a month. And then it was only in the summer. They changed that. And Dave saw that opportunity to rent the biggest arena in London, which was the London Arena. I think it held about 4,000 people and was packed for wrestling. And because Dave's shows were wild, Dave's shows were exciting, they weren't, there was no Lee Hennings or any 50-year-old guys going through the motions on his card. They were action-packed, and he actually started winning London, and he won London, and he promoted over 100 shows in London over his career. And Frank tried a couple times to come back, and just wasn't the same.
Okay, let's stay on that topic for a second, because that's one of the most common misconceptions that I find is that, when you look online, you look what people are saying on message boards or whatever, they'll often refer to the McKigney shows as the retirement tours, if you will. But that's not at all what they were. The McKigney tours were often featuring a lot of up and coming, a lot of young talent. And it's interesting to hear you talk about, selling a 4,000 seat arena in London, right, another misconception that we often hear is that McKigney was running these, 300-400 seat pavilions, arenas, whatever you want to call them, and that's simply not the case. And that's maybe one of the more common misconceptions that I see. What are you able to find in your research in regards to one, the types of talent that the Wildman was using, and two, the amount of fans that he was drawing in Ontario specifically, but maybe let's go more broadly speaking in Eastern Canada?
So, Andy, when Frank Tunney was coming to town, they would pay for the ad and a couple of write-ups before the show, and they would pay for a spot for the results. And Dave wouldn't usually pay for the results. He just paid for the ads. And so over the years, there was less and less and less results and less facts for sure about his shows, unless it was a town that hadn't seen wrestling for a long time. In London, he had a lot of press, and I'm not gonna, candy coat things. Sometimes they were great shows. Sometimes they weren't the greatest shows. Guys never showed up or anything. But yeah, in London, Ontario, he was packing them in. It was a sellout every 2 weeks in the summertime. Tony Marino, Tony Parisi, Eric the Red. He had the big K, who would have been a star in the AWA, had come out to Ontario for like 2 summers in a row. DiNucci was there for a while. His reach had started coming, and that was one of the times when he started pulling in big guys from around. He got Gorgeous George Jr. in 1971 from the Mid-Atlantic area. He came in for the whole season, and it was marvelous. And yes, Andy, there's no doubt that he may have hit a town and the weather was bad or this or that, and yeah, he maybe only sold 400 tickets. And I've seen the results on some shows where he maybe didn't make any money, but if you're playing an arena every 2 weeks and you're selling out 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 tickets, you're making money hand over fist. And back in the day, his tickets were $1.50, $2, and $3 for ringside. So 4,000 people at an average of even $2 is a lot of money.
Yeah, and the time frame as well is something that people seem to overlook because, you're looking at, like you said, ringside was $2 or whatever. Maybe it was $2.50 even, and your expenses are not now what they would be in today's day and age, if you will. So it is interesting to the fact that you're bringing up that you could sell out, you could have 2,000 people or whatever and do very well for yourself, and then keep doing that every 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. And continue to build the business up. That's something that I think is overlooked as well quite a bit in the now everything's now in wrestling research, if you will, and I use that term very loosely because there's not a lot of that done nowadays, as you very well know. Maybe let's back off of that aspect a little bit and let's talk about just the reach of the Wildman tours, because I think that's something that's overlooked as well. Can you go into a little bit of detail about, what would a typical run of the Wildman tour look like?
Well, Andy, I call it a database. It's not a database. It's a book. It's an old book. It's like a school book. And I started doing it I don't know, about 20-something years ago, writing down his arenas that he'd booked and the dates. And I just kept adding and adding and adding and adding and adding and adding. I still added actually 5 new dates just last week. So it's never going to stop. But the book page is jam-packed, and I'm squeezing another date in somewhere and writing the city down in the main event. And there's no more room on most of the pages. In the summer of 1974, when Archie Goldie came and headlined for him throughout Ontario, I don't think they stopped. Archie showed up on, I think, May 6th, and he left on September the 4th, I think. And I think they went every night throughout the whole summer, every night. And that I had a get together at my house about 5 or 6 years ago, and I had a map of Ontario on the wall, and some pictures of the wild man and his crew. And I had a map, and I highlighted all the cities and towns that he had wrestled in that I knew of back then. And the map was practically covered because there wasn't very many places he didn't go. I can't put it into any perspective because where we live now, there's just not the population. So you could say if someone lived in New York, upper New York State, he hit Fredonia, he hit Ellicottville, he hit Olean, he hit Tonawanda, he hit Grand Island, he hit Niagara Falls, New York, he hit Lewiston. I mean, he hit Rochester. It just didn't stop, and the circle went round and around and around.
And that's something else that I think a lot of people don't realize too. Is, a lot of people will focus on Maple Leaf Wrestling would do, this town this night, this town this night, this town this night, and repeat, right? Whereas the Wildman Tours was very much everywhere, right? Yeah. It wasn't a set schedule, and that's kind of what I'm getting at, right? It wasn't the same thing over and over and over. And I think maybe that's why he was so successful in all of these towns, is because he was bringing them something that they didn't see because nobody else was going there.
Absolutely.
And I think that's something that we need to understand as well, is that he was bringing a product to people who otherwise would not have access to this product. And then you have to think the time frame as well. We're talking about a time where cable TV is not a thing for very much, like almost at any of Ontario at that time. I know we live in Manitoba. It's a little bit different here population wise, but like back then in Ontario, the population was still, what would it have been? 10 million?
Yeah, farming communities didn't have cable. Farming communities lucky if they had two stations, like you said, around here back in the early 70s. There was no ice in the arenas. So guess what? They were empty. And I've read in the book, and the book Drawing Heat, believe me, Andy, I've read, I swear to God, 10,000 times. I've read every line in between every line and in between those lines to put a perspective on it. And I don't claim to be an expert or anything. I've read so much, and I've imagined so much, because I've practically got inside his head by putting myself in that spot, putting myself sitting shotgun in his truck, driving from town to town. And they would go and they would say, like, oh, geez, we haven't been to Banana. Oh, yeah. Well, we don't go there in the early summer because they don't have all the immigrants there collecting the corn or the tobacco or the whatever crops that were coming due. So that was, he never wrestled in Simcoe in the early summer, but in Simcoe, Ontario, in the late summer, he'd go every week. So there was a schedule for some places, but not very many. I mean, the poster crew was probably busy. I remember talking to one of the guys who worked on the poster crew, and they said they had probably 200 or 300 pounds of posters in their cars, and they were on the road all summer long, like 2 weeks ahead of the tour.
Yeah, which I could definitely see, because that's really the only way you could get around the pure logistical way of doing it back then, right? Again, there's no fax machines ain't a thing, internet ain't a thing, yeah. Right? It's not happening like that. Okay, so we've kind of covered the tours. Unless there's anything that I missed specifically that you want to talk about the tours.
You did mention the East Coast, and he went to the East Coast a couple times, but that was more in the 80s.
Yes.
Things weren't going well here. There's another thing with Frank and Dave that when the insurance premiums started going up in the late 70s, supposedly Frank lent him his insurance bond for a cost. And then something probably happened somewhere, and like I said, there's not reports on every car that happened in every little town, so we don't know. The bear could have got loose. Could have been a million things, right? We know how berserk the Sheik was on some of his shows, and he zipped some guy in I think Meaford, Ontario, which is up near Owen Sound, and he got taken to court, and it was on a Wild Man show. So, the bond was gone. Dave's regular guys were getting older, and he and Phil Watson went down east, and I think it was 80. I have it in my book, but it was in the early 80s, and they tried to weasel in on the East Coast promotions, and they had a few guys come over to work for them that were working down there, and they had a set schedule. He knew where he was going way before he even got down there. But and then of course there was another tour in the later 80s, in mid 80s, and then there was the unfortunately fateful tour in 88.
Now, the insurance thing is an interesting topic, and maybe this is a good time to, we'll get into some bear conversation now, because there are two big stories about the Bears that are legend. One infamously for one reason, and one is kind of a humorous one, if you will. So, maybe we'll start with the humorous one first, and the humorous one that I'm talking about is the $3,000 pin Ted challenge. You're familiar with this?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's been going on forever, yes. And
okay. So maybe talk to me about, I believe it was 1966. What happened with the $3,000 pin the Ted challenge?
Yeah, a chap in Ottawa said he pinned the bear, and as we found out, what's the word that. It's a possibility to pin a bear because it has round shoulders and a round back. So you'd actually have to be strong enough to pick the whole bear up and pin him like a cradle pin. And supposedly someone did it, and Dave never coughed up the money and took him to court. And Dave won because I know you can't pin a bear.
Which is just wild.
There's also, unfortunately, another thing that was really interesting, and I have a lot of information on this, was when the bear got arrested in Georgia.
Yes, please go into depth on that one as well.
So, and this was straight from Beverly Shade, who worked for Dave, and it was her. She was working on the card. Her husband and her were promoting outlaw promoting in Florida. And they booked Dave in, I think it's Lacoste, Georgia. And they went down. Someone went downstairs, and the cops got scared of the bear because they'd never seen one before. And the cops said the bear tried to bite him. The bear was arrested. They spent a week in jail. I mean, it's just berserk, right? There was actually pictures in the Associated Press throughout North America of Dave on the phoning his lawyer, and he obviously got like gazillions worth of promotion from that. But yeah, it's strange. We can talk about this a little bit after, some of the things that I have that I can't show, and I'll tell you why a little later. But I have lots of stuff on that, which is kind of a personal thing from someone else, and it's got to remain secret for the time being. But we can talk about it all we want. It's bizarre, and you got to figure in the 60s, southern states, anything could happen, right? And yeah, they arrested the bear. Dave had to throw up like $1,000 to get the bear out of jail, and he probably went back in the area 2 weeks later and probably booked the bear in every single arena he could get, and probably made the money back 10 times, right?
Now, one of the more disturbing bear stories is obviously the story involving Smokey. So I don't know how you want to approach this one, but it's something you got to talk about. So if you want to get into this one, or I can, it's up to you. I'm not sure.
It's a terrible, terrible story. It's what I've read, what I've heard. It was just a pile of misfortunate situations that just piled on top of each other. And the next, there's a tragedy. It was a tragedy, obviously. Terrible Ted was supposedly in a tree. That's where he liked to hang out. Dave was cleaning out the pens. And Smokey, for whatever reason, went in the house and just crushed Lynn Orser to death. And excuse me, it's so movie-like that it's hard to believe even, Andy. It's hard to believe. I was in the house myself. I saw the window where the bear came through. I saw where Dave, the area actually right where Dave smashed the couch over the bear's back. I saw the pen. It was surreal. It was just bizarre because in our world of how we are now, and you've mentioned this a couple times, in the quick pace now world, anything that's like that it can't be true. It must be a movie. It must be not real. It must be like a video game. It must be like something that can't really happen. And Jesus, it happened. It was like 1977 and it happened, and a lady died because of a bunch of circumstances that turned into a tragedy.
Now, obviously, I don't want to end us on that note. So maybe can you, without going into too much detail, what do you have that you want to talk about but you can't show? Like what's under wraps? Because now you've piqued my interest, and I got to know what you have, but it's kind of in your vault, if you will.
3 years ago. 3.5 years ago, I got a call from a man who said he was a documentary maker. I was like, okay. He goes, well, I've seen your Wildman Facebook page, and can we talk about maybe putting a project together? And believe me, Andy, I was like, what? What? I swear to God, I got off the phone and I Googled this guy right away, and the guy's a documentary producer. And he just phoned me, and he wants me to help him with a documentary on the Wildman. I was like, I shit myself. I was like crazy. I couldn't believe it. But on the same note, the book Drawing Heat, I knew about that about a year and a half in advance. And I didn't really believe that it was going to happen. I thought, well, maybe that'd be great. My friend Terry Dart, who was in the book Drawing Heat, he had given me an advance part of the manuscript, told me all about the book being put out, but it was taking a long time to get put out because he had to find a publisher and everything. The same with this documentary. I was privy to a bunch of personal stuff of Dave's that it's not really right to share. If it comes out in the documentary, then it's mine to share. The movie is still in the works, and if it ever comes to pass, that'll be great. And if it doesn't, I'm going to give it some time, and then I will just release what I have personally. It's nothing earth-shattering. It's nothing. It's not going to change the world. It's just a lot of information that I think a lot of people that are on the Wildman page, which, Andy, is like over 1,200 people now, they would like to see. They would like to know about. And it's just little tidbits of this, little tidbits of that, some legal documents and a few other things that are really kind of part of the story.
If there were things about the Wildman that you think that people should know or should look into, what would those things be?
That's a good question. I think that they should look into what we talked about earlier, his whole career, his everything that he did. I'm not delving into it deeply, but looking at a guy that became just Andy, he was a bit of a joke at one time. It was a joke in Ontario. Like, he's bringing another show to wherever. Oh God, Bobo, Jesus, Bobo and the Sheik. Who wants to see Bobo and the Sheik? But he had turned himself a little bit into a bit of a second-rate person, I think. It's not always rosy. Your life isn't always rosy. My life isn't always rosy. And geez, his life wasn't always rosy either. So there's aspects of his career that were fantastic. And I think that's great. But you have to remember that, there was parts of his promoting career that sucked. I mean, his live-in girlfriend got killed by a bear, and then he died on the highway doing what he loved. So an unbelievably tragic life, but spectacular as in having been a professional wrestler for over 30 years.
Now, why don't you go ahead and tell me what, during all of whether it's your research or things you've seen or things you've read, tell me something that's jumped out at you from either his life or his career, that's something that's really stood out to you as like a real hallmark moment, if you will, something that you saw and immediately drew you into him.
I think this is a kind of a soft answer, Eddie. To see the Sheik. Now, I didn't go to see the Sheik at Maple Leaf Gardens, and I'm glad I didn't, because you're sitting in with 16,000 other people, and yes, it would have been exciting and everything, but it just wouldn't have been the same. When I bought a ticket to go to a Wild Man show to see Louis Martinez and the Sheik in the main event, and the Sheik walked by me like 5 feet from me, and then him and Martinez were wrestling 5 feet from me, throwing each other around the crowd, that was worth everything. That was the penultimate moment for me. He brought the Sheik into places where people had only heard about him. Maybe not even, if they weren't complete wrestling fans, they didn't even look at the wrestling magazines, but they knew who the Sheik was. And to let's put it into perspective of Manitoba, a place like Ile de Chêne, they have a half-decent size arena there, and Dave would have booked that arena, and those fans in that area could have went and seen the Sheik, and up close and personal, right there, you could smell the blood, you could see the sweat like pouring off them because they were five feet away from you. Just ridiculously exciting. No doubt about it, bar none. Nothing else compares to being that close to such a famous wrestler.
And you wouldn't have got that experience if not for McKigney, right? Like
100%. And it was everywhere. Every arena where the Sheik was when he was working with him, those people were going to see that and get that thrill, that just pumping of their adrenaline by being 5 feet or 10 feet away from the Sheik. And even if they were sitting in the stands, most people would run down to ringside anyways because there was no control whatsoever. There was no ropes. There was no around the ring. There was nothing. I mean, if you pulled the chair out from beside you, you ran, right?
But was there anything that we didn't touch on tonight that you want to say or to make sure it makes air on this program?
I think that for an unknown outside of Ontario, because basically as general fan, he's an unknown guy out of Ontario other than his posters, but the lure of his promotion as people get to learn about it and to know that Sullivan worked there, Lewin worked there, yes, Brazil, yes, the Sheik, Andre the Giant worked for him close to 50 times over the years. Archie Goldie worked there. The list went on and on and on. The guys from Montreal, Carpentier would have worked for him. Hans Schmidt would have worked for him. The Rougeau's worked for him. It's unbelievable. Mad Dog Vachon worked for Dave in Sudbury once. I mean, Zabisco worked for him. DiNucci. Ivan Koloff came down once when he was in the WWA. The Blackjacks. Just unbelievable amount of talent coming to his I call them his small towns in Ontario. And it wasn't just a fluke. It wasn't just a thing. He had like a massive promotion with no TV, no internet, no cable, no nothing, just posters and newspaper ads. So, and word of mouth. So if I was going to say anything, I would like people to, if I can, on your show, tell people about the Facebook page, because there's over 8 years of stuff on that page that's going right from everything to anywhere. And it's just the Wild Man tribute page on Facebook. And I've been doing it, like I said, for close to 8 years now. And it's what I wake up every morning thinking about. Oh, what about this? What about that? Maybe I should put a poster on today or whatever. And It's so exciting and interesting to me to teach people about his promotion. And I really appreciate you giving me this opportunity to talk about him, because then we're going to even teach even more people about him.
This has been your episode of Grappling with Canada. This episode was written, researched, produced, and recorded by me, Andy the Taxman. You can find Grappling with Canada on all major podcasting platforms. Please make sure to rate and review 5 stars where available. You can also find Grappling with Canada on all major social media platforms. Just search Grappling with Canada on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. If you are willing and able to financially support Grappling with Canada, you can find links to PayPal and buymeacoffee.com on the Linktree link in today's show notes. You can also find links to the Grappling with Canada merchandise store in the show notes for today's episode. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with your friends and family. This is Andy the Taxman saying, thank you very much for supporting and listening to this program. Take care of yourselves and each other.